Hey, students, this is Professor Gore, and this is part three of the World War I recorded lecture. This is going to be probably the longest part just because it covers the war on the home front for the United States, as well as the war in Europe and so forth, and the U.S. role in that. So um, it's kind of interesting how quickly the United States ends up mobilizing because it's incredible the industrial capability that the United States does when it turns over all of its industries to the war effort, and how much the country got behind both World War One and then even more so with World War Two because we fought in it longer. So with only about 200,000 men in the armed forces in 1917, the U.S. government turned towards conscription, which anytime you hear conscription, all it means is a draft. The Selective Service Act, okay, so like if all 18-year-old adult male citizens are required to register for the Selective Service. Had to do that years ago when I was 18. But the Selective Service Act went into effect in May of 1917, and what more smoothing it had during the Civil War. Around 4 million men were drafted into service by the end of the war. Of course, a lot of those men never made it over to Europe because the war ended. President Wilson chose General John J. Pershing, whose nickname was Blackjack Pershing, to head the American Expeditionary Force. And before the new army could fight, it had to be trained and outfitted and transported across the submarine-infested Atlantic. When the U.S. entered the war, the German U-boats were sinking 900,000 tons of Allied ships each month. By sending the merchant and troop ships and armed convoys, the U.S. Navy cut down the rate to about 400,000 tons by the end of 1917. So there is you probably want to underline or star the Selective Service Act. All it was is just a draft, okay? And so anyone from 21 to 30 years and later extend to 40 years of age. You'll see later in the 20th century, we lower the draft age down to 18. We see that especially in Vietnam. And so with about 24 million men registered for the draft by the end of 1918, but only about 4 million or so were drafted. Now, the exact number is 2.8, but that's the ones that actually reported for duty. Because the war surprisingly ended in November of 1918. And so that 4 million number is a little bit off because of the timing of the armistice and so forth. So many were men on the boat or getting ready to leave. I had a coworker of mine whose grandfather was literally boarded the ship the day the armistice was signed to go to Europe. And so his ship never left Galveston, Texas. So it's kind of interesting. About 3.7 million men served in World War I. About 2 million saw active combat. This is all estimated, rounded off numbers. Also, what's just cool about the World Wars is the numbers of minorities that served during World War I and World War II. About 400,000 African Americans fought, and unfortunately, because of the racism of the day, you had segregated units. But you had about 15,000 Native Americans who, a generation or two before, were fighting potentially on the Great Plains or elsewhere. A lot of them served as scouts, messengers, or even snipers, but they were non-segregated units. You also had Hispanic Americans, German Americans, Italian Americans. A lot of recent immigrants were willing to serve in large numbers during World War I. And then we see that number even increase among all groups, no matter race or ethnicity in World War II. And even Japanese Americans who were interned in World War II, some of the men were given the option of getting out of the internment if they served in the military, and many of them went to serve in Europe. Here's Blackjack Pershing, leader of the American forces. Okay, so the American Expeditionary Force is what they called it. It's kind of copied off the British Expeditionary Force. We never called our military that before or since. But the British and the French and the Belgians refer to us as doughboys because we were fresh and never seen combat, or the Yanks are coming and so forth. This is a propaganda posters, Pershing's Crusaders, okay, playing off the old Crusades from the 1098. Not exactly a accurate depiction. And these are American troops in the trenches. These are pretty shallow trenches here. Here's some other American troops in the trenches. But what's happening simultaneously as U.S. entering the war is Russia is pulling out of the war. What had happened is Tsar Nicholas, who actually had a pretty good general with Brusilov, ended up firing him and then appointed himself as his own general. Foolish. A lot of the war was very unpopular among the military ranks. And the Germans had recruited Vladimir Lenin, who was in exile, gave him several thousands of dollars and sent him into Russia to help instigate and foment a revolution. Now, Lenin promised that if he succeeded in taking power, he would end the war, and he does just that. The Romanov family are actually executed, men, women, and children. Now, so the cause of the Russian Revolution is a lot of problems on the home front. You never have revolutions in good economic times. They're always in bad economic times. So they had food and fuel shortages, which is crazy considering that Russia was like the third largest grain producing country in the world. A lot of striking industrial workers. They were, after doing initially well in World War I against the Germans, the Ottomans, Austro-Hungarians, they were losing a lot of men and to the Germans. Of course, a lot of them were surrendering too. The Tsar was an ineffective ruler. And the communist propaganda really took hold among a lot of the industrial urban workers and so forth. So Tsar is overthrown. At one point, there was another guy that replaced him before Lenin. The problem is he continues on the war. If he wouldn't have continued on the war, there's a chance maybe the Bolsheviks hadn't taken over. But what ends up happening is that government is overthrown by the Russian, or the Lenin and his Bolshevik forces. Now, there were several different communist groups. The Bolsheviks were probably some of the most radical and the ones that end up taking power. But Russia erupts into a civil war after they pull out of the war. And what ends up happening is you have a civil war with the Red Army being the commies, and then you have the White Army being the non-communist. I don't really know. They weren't really democratic, but they certainly weren't communist. And the Red Army ends up prevailing. Now, the U.S. and other allied forces supported the White Army, which the communists never really kind of forgave the U.S. for that. In fact, here up in the north, right here is Archangels, where U.S. Military sent in troops to try to keep military supplies getting in the hands of the Germans and so forth. So most of the revolution takes place right here on the western part of Russia near Moscow and elsewhere. So Germany forces them with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where they lose a bunch of territory to the Germans, which the Germans in turn are going to lose it at the end of World War I. So let's look at what's going to happen in 1917, 1918 on the Western Front. So the Eastern Front has now been won by Germany and Austria-Hungary. And then on the Western Front, let's look what's going to happen. So in 1917, the Germans are pushing, but really it's their 1918 offensive. In fact, what's crazy is, as bloody as World War I was, more troops died in 1918, the last year of the war, than any other year. And that's crazy considering many people died at Verdun and the Somme and other German offenses and so forth. But as you can see right here, the coloring is the furthest extent the German advance had. There was several different battles because the Allies were running out of men. So what did the United States participate really that helped the Allies? So if I was teaching world history, I would cover this, but not explain as much about the American importance. But there was the battle at Cannes or Amiens, Belleau Wood, Chateau-Thierry, and Saint-Mihiel. All of those battles, Americans were used as reinforcements to plug the holes of the battered British and French forces. But really, the greatest contribution the United States gives to the Allies in the war effort, especially after Russia pulls out, is the amount of food and military supplies and clothing and shells and tanks and so forth. It's our supplies that saved the Allies in World War I. And it was incredible what the United States is able to contribute to the war effort. Now, to give you an idea, the difference in supplies between American forces and German forces. So in 1918, the average German soldier received about 6 ounces of beef or some other protein a day. Now, the people back home in Germany weren't even getting close to that, if they were getting meat at all. The average American, 20 ounces of beef or some other pork or something, chicken. And so Americans were so much better fed. And in fact, when Germans were captured, they talked about how jealous they were of American forces. So what ends up hurting the Germans in this summer offensive, because they almost won, 1, American supplies, 2, American reinforcements, but really They overextend themselves, and they pushed everything into trying to win here. But really, the other thing, it's one of the great pandemics of world history. It's not Black Death bad, but it's still pretty bad, or smallpox outbreak for among Native Americans in the Columbian Exchange. But what it is the Spanish flu. Now it's called the Spanish flu because it begins in Spain, and you have World War One, a perfect environment, unfortunately, for this deadly flu vaccine or a flu. I'm not vaccine, but flu strand to be so deadly. You have men in close quarters. You have men with a weakened immune system. You have unsanitary conditions, and you have this rare strand of the influenza virus that happens to be deadly. 1 out of 4 people that contracted it worldwide died. That's really, really high rates of deaths from the influenza. In fact, every year, health officials always worry, is this going to be the year that strand comes back? Because we think, according to history, that's not the first time the Spanish flu has ever hit, or whatever you want to call it, centuries before. So Chateau Thierry and Belleau Wood, about 60,000 Americans are used to help. Saint Mihiel, American forces attacked very ferociously and aggressively to help drive back the Germans. Germans were just shocked at how the United States is willing to, these men were just willing to get themselves slaughtered to drive them back. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, what ends up happening here, if you go back and look at this map, here, the Meuse-Argonne offensive, let me show you, this is right there. It was strictly an American front. All these other engagements where the American troops fought at, they were in secondary units, maybe under British or French division commander, but this one was actually led by John J. Pershing, and it's strictly Americans fighting on this front. And it was a very heavily forested area of Belgium in the Argonne Forest, but on the Meuse, near the Meuse River, which is why it's called that. And so Americans were driving Germans back. In fact, on the day the armistice was signed, there was literally still fighting about an hour, hour or two after the armistice was signed. In fact, around 12:30 on that day, because the armistice was supposed to go into effect at 11 a.m. When Americans heard about it, they jumped out of their trenches to cheer, and a German machine gunner shot them down. And so, anyway, it was terrible, but those men were shot and killed for no reason, especially when the war ended. And so, anyway, but what happens is people started rioting in Germany because of the British naval blockade. They weren't getting supplies. German naval soldiers began rioting on the coastal cities, and so the Kaiser abdicated to Holland or Netherlands, and eventually the German generals decided to see if they could end the war. Now, when they ended the war and they agreed to do the armistice, they assumed that they were getting Wilson's 14 points. And we'll find out when we get to Treaty of Versailles lecture, they don't really get hardly any of those. And so anyway, the United States helped push back Germans near the town of Verdun, which was where a terrible offensive took place in 1915, 1916. And 26,000 Americans died trying to push them back. So cover the Spanish flu. It's terrible. But the armistice is signed on November 11th, which is why we have Veterans Day on November 11th. But it was at 11 a.m. So the 11th day of the 11th month at 11 a.m. Now, if you've ever read the book All Quiet on the Western Front, it's written by a German author. And to show the irony of that, the main character, Peter, is killed by a sniper on that morning to show the stupidity of the World War I. But really, it's the American troops kind of serving as reinforcements, and the supplies the Americans sent, which we're going to cover the home front in just a second, help secure an Allied victory. But this is all estimated because you count the casualties after the war that were died because of war wounds but didn't die immediately. So 53,000 Americans, rounded off, estimated were killed in action. 203,000 were wounded. And here's the places U.S. troops were sent. We were sent to France, Belgium, Italy. We've had some that kind of forgotten part of World War I is that we had some American troops sent to the Italian front to help Italy's forces against the Austrian-Hungarians, and then we sent to Archangel in Russia to try to stop the Germans from getting Russian military supplies. Here's Alvin York, the most decorated American during World War I. He is a Medal of Honor recipient. Guy was a beast. He was actually a Quaker, which Quakers were pacifists. He gets drafted, debated about dodging the draft, but decided not to. And basically what he does to win the Medal of Honor is pretty impressive. I've read several reasons why people won the Medal of Honor. I've read some more robust ones than this one, but he actually took a whole machine gun nest by himself, and then by himself took 132 prisoners at the Battle of Chateau Thierry in the Meuse Argonne campaign. So this guy's a beast. I mean, 132 Germans just surrendered to him. Here's Eddie Rickenbacker, the famous pilot who was a professional race car driver before the war. And he downed 26 German planes himself, and he was our most famous flying ace. Now, he's nowhere near the Red Baron, but still impressive. Way to go, Rickenbacker. Here is the Red Baron, the myth, the legend. He gets shot down and killed. And it's crazy, when he crashed near French lines, and they stripped him naked of all of his valuables because they were going to pawn it off. It's a little creepy. But so what's interesting is that 1/5 of the U.S. fighting force was foreign-born. Well, that makes sense because you have so many immigrants that had come over to the United States. Many believe that this would Americanize the immigrants. African Americans were by far treated the worst. They made up 13% of the American armed forces. 92% were draftees, a far higher rate than that of whites. Blacks were organized into rigidly segregated units and almost always under the control of white officers. This is really one of the great tragedies of American history. In addition, blacks were assigned to the most menial tasks, such as kitchen and cleanup details. Racial violence occurred in military camps as well. Black members of the 24th Infantry's 3rd Battalion killed 15 white soldiers and police officers in retaliation for a string of racial incidents. You had a similar thing down in Brownsville, Texas during Teddy Roosevelt's presidency. In fact, he kind of somewhat admitted privately he made a mistake in how he handled it. Anyway. Also, about 13,000 Native Americans served, which was 25% of the adult male Native American population, which is impressive considering what had happened the century before. But after the armistice, American troops quickly came home and adjusted to civilian life. Many members of the AEF never saw combat. Many of these soldiers had never traveled beyond their hometowns. One of the things that's founded is the American Legion, that was formed by World War I veterans to remember their service. I actually played American Legion baseball in Arkansas growing up in high school. Here are an all-black unit as they're getting ready to board a ship to go over to France. Now let's talk about the home front. Fighting World War I required an extraordinary economic effort on the home front. At the height of mobilization, 1/4 of the gross national product went for war production. The government focused on volunteerism to be successful, and the U.S. supplied the Allies with war material as well as cash long before the U.S. entered the war. This showed the U.S. became a major player in the international financial affairs and world politics in the years to come. So one of the things is how they're going to pay for the war. Well, they paid for the war by the selling of war bonds, also raising income taxes. In fact, the highest income tax earners got their income tax like 90-something% by Woodrow Wilson. That's nuts. So the sale of war bonds, basically what a war bond is that you're buying an investment in the government, and then it's supposed to grow with interest as the government and the economy advances. So they called them Liberty and Victory loans. So you're giving a loan to the government like a bond, and so it's like, oh, if you're paying this, you're protecting American liberty. If you're buying this, you're guaranteeing victory. So they would use these clever words to convince Americans to support the war. And the United States, both in World War I and World War II, was propagandized tremendously, and it was brilliant propaganda that worked very well. Both sides, the Central Powers and Allies powers, use a lot of propaganda to motivate their population to support the war, for a tremendous amount of nationalism and so forth. Now, because of the war, the federal government expands to its largest extent up to this point in American history. They create a whole war industries board who was run by a very successful businessman, Bernard Baruch, extremely efficient. The Food Administration is headed up by future American President Herbert Hoover. He does a great job, and really we become the breadbasket of the Allies. The Railroad Administration is really in charge of transportation. William McAdoo also did a good job. And then ex-President William Howard Taft really led to great relations between bit factory owners and laborers. Laborers were getting the best wages they ever had up to this point in American history, and you have happy workers. They do good work. So here's Herbert Hoover. Okay. So farm production increased by 25%, which is nuts. Food exports tripled. And so one of the things is that the United States Navy is built up by building new ships, but it takes a while to build those ships. So they began arming merchant ships. And they even used such thing as a concrete ship, which is pretty crazy to think about. Here's Bernard Baruch, Hoover, and Taft. I don't have a picture of McAdoo, I'm sorry. Here's some propaganda posters. You can always tell when it's a World War I German helmet because they have these little metal things that stick out right here. So halt the Hun. And actually, where in Star Wars, where stormtroopers came from, stormtroopers were kind of like the elite German forces, kind of like the Army Rangers. And that's where George Lucas got the idea for the stormtroopers in Star Wars. All right. So one of the things is the United States is going to be more socialistic during World War One. And so they forced all industries to make stuff for the war effort, and the United States does it willingly, both in World War I and World War II. And we really do it brilliantly. And so the government is going to control the economy. The only time that the government's truly controlled the economy is during World War I and World War II. And this, some people call it a contradiction of the free market. Others call it a necessity during Great War effort. And so here's some planes that are being built. Here are tanks, shells. My word. Obviously, smoking was not allowed there. And so we become the breadbasket of the world. They also, Hoover was able to convince Americans to do what they would call meatless Mondays, wheatless days, where you wouldn't buy bread or you wouldn't buy meat. They convinced Americans to grow gardens in their own backyard. So that way it would cut down on the amount of food being bought at grocery stores. And Americans, for the most part, did it willingly, both in World War I and World War II. And it really is kind of one of our better moments in American history. Here we have the prejudice and so forth and the armed forces towards African Americans, but which is bad. But on the other hand, you have this incredible mobilization for the war effort. And a lot of Americans really, really came together on this, which is cool. More propaganda posters. Food will win the war. Dang right. So trying to get you to use molasses instead and save powdered sugar. And this is more propaganda posters. Getting them to grow, kids to grow gardens. Trying to get Americans to use less coal to heat their homes, so maybe just put on more blankets, save gasoline. Later in World War II, they implemented a nationwide speed limit of 55 to get people to use less gas. So unemployment, if you couldn't find a job during World War I, you were just incompetent. You could find a job somewhere in a factory. Expansion of big government, excessive government regulations on the economy. World War I and World War II is the greatest regulation in American history of the economy. And so you do have some mismanagement with overlapping jurisdictions, but for the most part, it really, really ran well. Private business owners worked well with government officials to produce stuff for the war effort, and even more so during World War II. World War II lasts longer, which is why you see it really extend even more so. And so also you had new opportunities for recent immigrants, African Americans moving in large numbers from the South to the North. It really was a great time to be a worker in a factory in terms of pay. The guy who is Wilson puts in charge of selling the American public on the war is George Creel, and it's called the Committee on Public Information. They're the ones that did all of the propaganda posters. And they had about 150,000 workers that were working on this. Later in World War II, the guy who wrote the Dr. Seuss books and drew all those, he actually was a worker for the propaganda posters and so forth. Remember Belgium, talking about Germans stealing women, because they did rape some. Destroy the mad brute. Beat back the Hun. They always refer to the Germans as the Huns of World War I. That was just propaganda. The Huns were actually from Central Asia, close to Mongolia. They did invade. Germany actually drove the Germanic people into the Roman Empire during world history. Helped crush the menace of the seas. The world must be safe for democracy. Now, the world cannot live half slave, half free. It's kind of a contradiction to the Jim Crow South. enlists in the Navy. This right here is one of the most famous propaganda, if not the most famous propaganda poster in American history. I used to have it up in my classroom, and this is actually a World War I Army recruiting poster. Here's another one called the Navy. Another one, buying war bonds. So labor unions improved. The National War Labor Board was designed and run by Taft to make workers happy, happy, happy. The American Federation of Labor grew in membership. Black and Mexican American workers found large amounts of work and better wages than they ever had before. And what I want you to highlight, star, and definitely memorize this is that women played an vital role in the war effort. You will see this on a test. You will see this on a quiz. When I taught AP US history, it was always on the AP exam every year. Women play a very important role in World War I and World War II. You had in World War II about 6 million women that worked outside the home, never had before. I don't have the statistics off the top of my head in World War I. It's not as many as World War II because World War II lasted longer. But so women got higher wages than ever before. Women helped support the war effort, not only in the factories, but at home. And they played a very important role in the United States, but also women played a very important role in both the Central Powers and the Allied powers during World War I. In fact, just about all the countries that fought in World War I reward their women with the right to vote after World War I, and that doesn't happen as soon as it does without World War I actually occurring. So you have the first great migration in American history of African Americans leaving the South in large numbers and either going to the North or going to the West Coast. Not as many went to the West Coast, you can see, but some. And it occurs even more so during and after World War II. Okay, so here's women participation. Go get it. As a welder, that's a skilled job. Now, as a result of women's role, you're going to see more women pushing for the right to vote, and that eventually does happen. Okay, so as I mentioned, the 18th Amendment comes about because of it was seen as anti-German. When I talked about this in the Progressive Era lecture, and but the 18th Amendment that wouldn't have happened probably without World War I, and then the 19th Amendment happens with right in 1920, and so they were able to vote an election that Warren G. Harding won. And so the National American Women's Suffrage Association, through the support of its 2 million members behind the Wilson administration, its president, Carrie Chapman Catt, argued that women had to prove their patriotism to advance the cause of the suffrage movement. NAWSA labored exhaustively to promote food conservation, to protect children and women workers, and to distribute emergency relief through organizations like the Red Cross. Alice Paul founded a more militant women's group called the National Women's Party in 1916. They picketed the White House, went on hunger strikes, and were arrested. So Carrie Chapman Catt, more moderate, Alice Paul, more left-leaning on at this particular time. In January of 1918, Wilson urged support for women's suffrage as a war measure, and eventually it was passed on August 26, 1920. Now, there was a tax on American civil liberties, okay? So I want to emphasize that if you've had me for U.S. History 1, I've mentioned this a couple times. Anytime the First Amendment rights in American history have been limited, it's been in a time of war. The first time it happens is with the Alien Sedition Acts during the Quasi-Naval War with France and John Adams' presidencies at the end of the 1700s. The second time is the suspension of habeas corpus by Abraham Lincoln during World War I to try to stop spying. The third time is the Espionage and Sedition Acts during World War I, which I'm going to cover. And then the fourth time is with the Japanese Americans internments and the censorship of the press during World War II. And then you have that again with the Patriot Act, with the War on Terror right after 9/11. And so as a spirit of conformity pervaded the home front, many Americans found themselves targets of suspicion. The American Protective League were citizens who were furnished badges by the Justice Department and were told to spy on neighbors and coworkers. That's not good. In 1918, the members of the League staged violent raids against draft evaders and opponents of the war. Now, there was a little more resistance to World War I than there was in World War II. Now, is it large numbers? No. World War II, it's very difficult to find that. German Americans were punished the most by this, with German composers' music being banned and German food being renamed hamburgers, became Liberty sandwiches, which is funny. During the war, law enforcement officials tolerated little criticisms, established values, and institutions. Now, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 were passed to curb dissent. All right. And so the Sedition Act focused on disloyal speech, writing, and behavior that might incite, provoke, or encourage resistance to the U.S. or promote the cause of its enemies. The Espionage Act imposed stiff penalties for anti-war activities and allowed the federal government to ban treasonous material from the mails. More than 1,000 people were convicted of these two laws. The Justice Department focused particularly on the socialists who criticized the war and the draft, and on radicals like the Industrial Workers of the World, whose attack on militarism threatened to disrupt war production in the Western lumber and copper industries. In September of 1917, Justice Department arrested 113 Industrial Workers of the World leaders and charged them with interfering with the war effort. Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison. In fact, he ran for president in 1920 from prison and got almost 1 million votes. Okay. Victor Berger, a Milwaukee socialist, was twice prevented from taking his seat at the House of Representatives for being jailed twice under the Espionage Act, and so forth. Okay. So here's a little information about the Espionage Act. So fines up to $10,000. Who's got money to pay for that? Okay. About 1,600 people or so were arrested. Now, there was a Supreme Court case that challenged this. Okay. Now, in Schneck versus United States in 1919, because it didn't go to the Supreme Court until the year after the war ended, the Supreme Court upheld the conviction of General Secretary of the Socialist Party, Charles T. Schneck. What Schneck had done was he had mailed pamphlets urging draftees to resist induction in the Army. They viewed that as treasonous. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes declared that the freedom of speech guarantees by the First Amendment did not extend to words that constitute a clear and present danger of the safety of the country. So basically what the Supreme Court said is by inhibiting the war effort or really disrupting it, it created a clear and present danger for the majority of American citizens because we needed to win the war. And so it said that your First Amendment rights is not protected because of the clear and present danger clause. So let's give an example to present day that I used to always give to students. Let's say that you are at school and you make a threat to bring a bomb to school. Okay. Now, you may be joking, you may not be, but because that represents a clear and present danger possibility to your fellow classmates and teachers and administration, you are not protected by free speech, and disciplinary actions can come upon you. So you do have freedom of speech, but it cannot lead to danger and so forth to individuals. Okay. So you maybe say free speech, but if you're calling for somebody's murder, that's going to be a problem. Okay. And anyway. So this is what the Supreme Court said, that every act of speech must be judged according to the circumstances in which it was spoken. Words can be weapons. The question in every case is whether the words used in such circumstances are of such nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. And so they said under normal circumstances, it would be perfectly legal to do that. But because World War I was going on, the circumstances was different. Okay. There's also another case, Abrams versus U.S., and similar situation, and they used the clear and present danger doctrine as well. All right, and that's it of World War I. We'll cover the Treaty of Versailles in a separate lecture.